I think I'm just going to open my front door and let them in. At this point, I'm not sure if there's just one of them or a whole group. The knocking constantly rings in my head, even when they're not present. The knocking varies in severity. Sometimes it's no more than a quiet tapping, and other times it sounds like a battering ram is being used on my front door. I'm sitting down against my front door now, and I can feel each knock vibrate through my body every time they slam one of their twisted bodies against my door. The voices are the most unnerving part. They're ever-changing. Sometimes I hear a child's voice, and sometimes the voice is so low and full of bass that I can barely make out the words that are being said. Sometimes the voice will be a gentle whisper, and other times it is a violent, hateful shouting. This has been going on for the past week. They repeat variations of the same phrases during their knocking. Let me in. Let us in. Please let us in. You have to let me in. We will save you. Let me in. In. Us in. Us in. Please. In. I just recently purchased a house on the outskirts of St. Louis. It's not completely out of the city, but I have woods that back up to the backyard, which, for most people, means you live in the boondocks. The few neighboring houses are blocked by trees that seem to purposefully divide the properties. I feel like I'm hours away from the city, when, in reality, I'm only about 20 minutes away from the hustle and bustle. I was standing in the yard anxiously waiting for my realtor to arrive with my key. The house was a warm, khaki-coloured craftsman-style house with a big front porch and a bright red door. I don't know why, but I've always wanted a house with a red door. It just seems so inviting. The shutters were a dark brown, and that red door was the focal point. I dug in my purse for a cigarette and started to walk to the backyard. The yard had a 7-foot privacy fence that went all the way back to the woods behind the house. There was also a wraparound deck that had been freshly stained a deep mahogany colour. I took a deep inhale from the cigarette and watched as the exhaled smoke swirled up into the colourful early morning sky. As I walked towards the side gate that led into the backyard, I couldn't help but stare into the woods. I found it odd that the wood seemed so dark, even though the sun was casting its warm yellow light on everything else. I'm not sure what it was that seemed to be metaphorically calling me, but I started to walk slowly towards the woods. I jumped as I felt a hand gently grab my arm from behind me. I let out a yelp and spun around to find my realtor. She was a petite woman in her 60s and was wearing a colourful suit skirt number. She looked at me over her glasses and, for a moment, I saw concern in her grey eyes, but that quickly left. "Didn't your mother ever tell you not to wander off into the woods by yourself?" she asked with a seemingly forced chuckle following. "You scared me to death," I said, now laughing myself. She smiled and her eyes appeared to be focusing on me, but she seemed to be looking past me. She looped her arm through mine and dangled the key in the air between her thumb and pointer finger. I gingerly took the keys from her and woo-hooed into the air. I felt like a kid in a candy store. I gently broke free from her and ran up to the door. I dropped the key the first time. I was so excited. I put the key into the deadbolt and turned it, and paused a moment before I opened the door. I walked into the house and breathed in deeply. Everything had just been cleaned. The dark grey hardwood floors looked like sheets of glass due to them having been freshly waxed. Everything was perfect. I turned to see my realtor coming back from her car with a bottle of wine in the crook of her arm and 2 dainty glasses in her opposite hand. I waved her in and she made her way to the kitchen. She sat the bottle of wine on the counter and said, "Ha! Champagne is overrated," through a grin. She pulled a corkscrew from her pocket and handed it to me. "I'm afraid my strength isn't what it once was," she smirked, and I quickly opened the bottle and poured each of us a glass. It was nearly 8 a.m. in the morning, but in celebration of me buying my dream home, I thought a glass or 2 was fitting. After sipping on the glass of wine and chit-chatting for 10 to 15 minutes, my realtor said that she had, unfortunately, an early showing with some very snarky clients and couldn't afford to be late. I shook my head in understanding and walked her to her car. As she got in her car, I saw her stare into the woods. "Do be careful out here, my dear," she said, and gently squeezed my arm before completely getting into the car. I thought this was odd, as she knew I was originally from an area much more rural than this one, and I was very comfortable in this setting. She sped off rather quickly, and I was left standing there with a hand on my hip as I thought about what she'd said. I turned to walk back into the house, and as I did, my peripheral sight caught movement in the direction of the woods. I shot my gaze in that direction, but was met with nothing. I put my hand on my forehead and started to laugh. I walked into the house and casually walked through each room. I ran my hand up the banister as I made my way upstairs. I walked to the window that looked over the front yard and pulled my phone from my pocket to check the time. 8:30 a.m. it read. The movers would be here within the next 30 minutes. I walked into one of the 2 spare bedrooms and was met with a view of the woods. I thought I saw a small figure, maybe a young boy, standing in the still dark woods, when my concentration was broken by a loud knock on the door. I gasped and took a second glance to the edge of the woods and was met with nothing. There was nothing there but trees and brush. I shook my head and chuckled as I walked down the stairs. I opened the door to find the movers. They'd shown up early, which I was thrilled about. I was extremely ready to get all my things into my new house. It would really make it feel like home. It took the movers about 2 hours, and now I was left with a house full of furniture and stacks of labelled boxes. I wasn't sure where to begin, but I figured the kitchen would be the best place to start. I started to unpack my dishes. As I was putting the glasses into the cabinet, a sharp, sudden knock startled me, and the glass I was holding fell to the floor, shattering into small teeth-like shards on the tile floor. I let out an aggravated sigh and started to walk towards the door. Right before I touched the knob, another loud knock rang from the door. I hesitated and pulled my hand away from the door. I slowly inched my hand towards the knob and flung it open to find nothing. I walked out to the porch and looked around, and I didn't see anyone, or anything for that matter. I shrugged it off and decided to go back to unpacking. Maybe it was just a local kid playing a prank. As soon as I was in the kitchen, I heard another knock on the door. I was a little aggravated at this point and stomped to the door and flung it open to find a middle-aged woman and a little girl peering from behind her. I smiled and introduced myself. The lady seemed nervous, but nice. She was holding a plate, or a platter of some kind, with plastic wrap over it. She extended it to me with a small smile, and I found it was a plate full of cookies. I gently took the platter from her hand and thanked her. I live down the road, and I saw the moving truck here earlier. I hope I'm not interrupting you. I just wanted to come over and be neighborly. I'm Margaret, she said, as her eyes darted around the porch. The little girl had her thumb in her mouth and was still peering from behind her mother. I really appreciate the thought. I love it out here. The woods in the back are nice, and I don't think I have anything to worry about any new neighbors. I chuckled, but stopped when I saw the look on her face. Her face was very pale, and she seemed uncomfortable. I hate to rush off, but I have to get started on lunch soon. She started to turn to walk down the porch steps, but she suddenly turned back around. You just be real careful out here. It gets a little spooky at night. She gave me a half smile and grabbed the girl by the hand. She nearly jogged to the street and soon disappeared as she made a right turn out of my driveway. I stood there with the door open for a few minutes and found it so odd that she was so nervous. It was like she was scared or worried about something. Surely I didn't scare her. I'm in no way intimidating. Just an average-sized woman. I'm 5'5" and 150 pounds. I made my way back into the kitchen and sat the cookies on the counter. I spent the rest of the day unpacking and getting the house in order, and everything was quiet. I decided that I should just throw a pizza in the oven and call it a day. I'd taken a week off work to enjoy the house. I was a homebody and didn't really use a lot of my vacation time, so I was going to enjoy the time from work. I went into the living room and turned on the TV for some background noise. I had my nose buried in my phone, but I enjoyed the white noise. The oven timer started beeping and I made my way into the kitchen. I walked through the foyer to get to the kitchen, and as soon as I walked by the front door, I heard a knock. This was a very quiet knock, and if I hadn't been right by the door, I don't think I would have even heard it. I didn't open the door, I just walked up to it and leaned my ear in to listen. Again, I heard a light knocking. I unlocked the door and opened it, but left the storm door closed and locked. I didn't see anyone there. I turned the porch light on and, out at the edge of my yard, outside of the light from my porch light, was a figure. I focused on it for a few minutes, and it looked like a young boy. I looked down to unlock the door, and when I looked back up, the figure was gone. I could only assume that this kid was somehow initiating me into the neighborhood by playing some knock and dash or something. I took my pizza out of the oven and, luckily, it hadn't burnt to a crisp. I walked back by the door and this time, instead of a knocking, I heard the voice of a child. "Hello? Is anyone home?" the voice said from the other side of the door. I unlocked and opened the door to find a young boy standing there. He was kind of looking at the ground, and he was holding his hands limply at his side. "Are you lost? Do you need me to call someone for you?" I asked him. I started to unlock the screen door, but I stopped. The boy repeated the same phrase. "Hello? Is anyone home?" His voice was very flat, and it seemed almost rehearsed in a way. I thought this was very strange, so I tapped on the glass to get his attention and asked, "Are you okay, kid?" With the first tap, he started to slowly raise his head up. When he did, I was met with the scariest eyes I've ever seen. They were black, pitch black, and empty. He stared at me before saying the same sentence, but this time it was slower and deeper, like it was in slow motion. "Hello? Is anyone home?" As he was saying this, a smile was stretching across his small face. I slammed the door shut and quickly locked it. I yelled through the door, now closed, "Kid, just go home. You got me, okay? You pranked me. Now, go home or I'm gonna call the cops." I peered out of the window closest to the door that viewed the porch, and I didn't see any sign of the kid. I sighed and shook my head and slowly walked to the kitchen to cut the pizza. I just couldn't shake how strange the kid was. I've never encountered such a weird kid. Where did he get those crazy contact lenses? What kind of parents does he have? I brushed it all off and decided that I wasn't going to let some bratty, weirdo kid ruin my first night in my new house. The next morning I woke up around 8 a.m., which for me was pretty late. I was used to getting up at 6 a.m. to get ready for work. My bedroom window caught my eye. I hadn't hung any curtains in my house yet, as it was a pain, and I just hadn't felt like messing with it yet. But I noticed that the window seemed awfully dark. I know the blinds were closed, but I could see a shadow through them on the window. I slowly pulled the blinds up, and my jaw dropped. There were small handprints all over my window. They were brownish black. I could assume it was paint or mud. There were so many. They littered my window, only allowing a small amount of light between some of the fingers of the prints. I threw on some jeans and a t-shirt and walked downstairs. I went to the outside of my house to get a better look. I made my way slowly around the side of my house. I walked slowly and looked on the ground for footprints or remnants of paint. I didn't find evidence of anyone being in my yard. I peered up at my window and made a very scary realization that I'd not thought about in my early morning state. My bedroom is on the second story of my house. I got that eerie feeling you get when someone is staring at you, and my eyes shot to the woods. I didn't see anything, but I knew someone or something was there, staring back at me. I made a beeline to the road and started to walk in the direction I'd seen Margaret walking in. I wasn't sure what her house looked like, but I ran into one about a half-mile down the rural road. It was by luck, or maybe fate, that she was outside hanging laundry on the clothesline to dry. She didn't notice me at first, and I called to her as I started to head her way. Her little girl was playing with a doll a few feet away from her. She had a confused look on her face when she saw me, and met me halfway in the middle of her front yard. "Oh, what a nice surprise," she said when we were a few feet away from each other. I nervously put my hands in my pockets and looked at the ground for a few seconds. I was getting ready to speak when she interrupted me. "You've had some strange things happen, haven't you?" I looked at her intently. "How did you know?" She walked closer to me and squeezed my arm. "You need to leave that house." "But I just moved in yesterday," I interrupted with a sarcastic laugh. She shook her head. "I know. I was hoping this time would be different. But I hope that every time someone moves in, you're in danger. You need to leave as soon as you can. I can't help you, or they'll know." She trailed off, and a tear slid down her face. I scoffed quietly, as I didn't know what to say. "Who will know? What are you talking about?" I asked, now becoming a little aggravated. "There are small handprints all over my second-story window, and some kid has been pranking me," I replied in a louder tone. "I'm not putting my daughter at risk. My husband tried to help the last owners and..." She stopped for a second, and I could tell she was choking back the tears. "Listen, I can't help you. I'm sorry, but you need to get out of that house. Just go home and get in your car and leave before it's too late." She turned and hurried across the yard and motioned for her daughter to follow her in the house. I stood there with my mouth slack in awe at what had just happened. This lady has got to be off her rocker. I will admit that what had been happening was strange, but I wouldn't let some punk kids chase me off. I stomped home, mumbling to myself. I'm sure I looked absolutely crazy. I hope I did look crazy. Maybe it would scare these stupid brats and they would just leave me alone. I went down to the basement of the house and dragged my power washer up the stairs and rolled it to the side of the house. I looked up at the window and my blood started to boil. I turned the power washer on and sprayed the window. And to my surprise, the prints were slowly coming off the window. The dark brownish-black liquid dripped slowly down the side of the house. After getting the weird, sludge-like substance off the window and the side of the house, I lugged the power washer to my porch and dug in my pocket for my smokes. I inhaled deeply, and my stress started to decrease a little. The rest of the day was, thankfully, uneventful. However, as the sun started to set, things started to change. The normal night sounds of crickets and peeper frogs were absent. I was sitting out on the back deck smoking a cigarette and rolling the events of the day over and over in my mind. None of what I was experiencing, or how people were acting, made sense to me. Why was everyone telling me to be careful? This was one of the lowest crime areas in St. Louis. I threw my head back and exhaled the cancerous smoke from my lungs. I threw my head forward suddenly and, as I did, I heard a loud thump, and then a dragging sound starting at the back of my privacy fence that met the woods. It sounded like something big and sharp being dragged down the fence. And then it stopped. I'd been holding my breath for several minutes unknowingly to myself. I started to take a deep breath, and when I did, the fence started shaking. It sounded like a mob of people were trying to knock down my fence. The posts rattled and shook. It reminded me of what would happen in an earthquake, only the earth was still. I got up slowly, watching the shaking fence closely, and backing up towards the back door. As soon as my hand grazed the doorknob, the shaking stopped. I stood there frozen, unsure of what was going to happen next. Was I dreaming? Or just going crazy? Then a boy leapt up from the other side of the fence and balanced in a crouching position on the thin fence post. My eyes followed the border of the fence, and similar-looking children started to appear. They seemed to be leaping up from the ground to the top of the fence, which was impossible. My fence was 7 feet tall. They were both boys and girls. Their skin was very pale and had a greyish tint to it. Their clothes were worn and dirty, and their hair was matted and unkempt. Their eyes were the worst part. They were deeply sunken into their emaciated faces, and the eyes were completely black. They all sat there, silently. I don't even think they were breathing, but I can't be sure. The boy closest to me was the one who was at my door last night. I still had my hand on the doorknob, and I knew I had to make a quick decision. I didn't know who or what these kids were, but they were not normal. I decided that I would open the door as quickly as I could and then run inside, lock the door, and call the cops if things escalated. I did this all in one swift turn of my wrist, and as soon as the door creaked open, the boy closest to me grinned and leapt off the fence and cleared the 7-foot gap from the fence to the deck. I barely had the door closed when he slammed into it. He had his face pressed up against the glass, and he was banging on it and screaming. It wasn't like any sound I have heard a human ever make. The shrillness of the scream brought me to my knees, and I put my hands over my ears and started to yell, "Stop!" over and over. As quickly as this happened, the screaming came to an end, and I could hear the children murmuring. I removed my hands from my ears and held my breath as they were speaking quietly. "Miss, please let us in. Let me in. You have to help us. Don't you want to help us?" It sounded normal at first, but then their voices started to distort and change, and every child seemed to be speaking on a different octave, but all in unison. "Let me in. You have to let me in. I'm hungry. We just want to chew your skin. Please, miss." Then the knocking started. It wasn't just at the door, though. It was everywhere. It was on the walls, the roof, the doors, the windows. Between the knocking and the words, "Let me in," and "Let us in," would come through. I crawled over to the kitchen island and sat behind it. I couldn't be seen in this position, and I pulled my knees to my chest. I fumbled in my pants pocket to get my phone. I typed in the numbers 911 with a shaking hand. The line rang once, twice, and then there was static. "Hello?" I stuttered out. "They're not going to be able to help you." A unison of children's voices came through the speaker. "They're not coming. No one can help you. Let me in. In. Let us in." Then the phone cut to an ear-shattering static. I dropped my phone and I started to yell, "Why are you doing this?" over and over. Tears started to fill my eyes and mascara trailed down my cheeks. I covered my ears and started to repeat in a whisper to myself, This isn't real. This isn't real. It was the last thing I remembered about this night. I don't know when the knocking stopped, or when I fell asleep, but I woke with a start, lying in a ball on the kitchen floor. My back and neck ached, and I let out a quiet moan as I rose to my feet. I placed my hand on the small of my back and slowly walked to the counter to make some coffee. What the fuck was up with those kids? I thought to myself. I hate to call them kids, because I knew they were so much more. Perhaps some old evil was merely taking the form of something innocent. My next thought was, what the fuck am I going to do? I peered out the glass panes of the back door and found it covered in streaks of fingerprints. I shuddered as I replayed last night over and over in my mind. I grabbed a cup of coffee and slowly unlocked my door. I waited for a few seconds and peered out of the window. I didn't see any sign of movement other than a few birds fluttering from one side of my fence to the other. I cautiously opened the door and again waited for a few seconds. I didn't see anything, so I continued outside. I left the door open and stayed within a few feet of it. I stared into the woods, and some of the branches of the tree closest to the fence rustled. I squinted to make out the outline that was barely visible. The woods were so dark, it was like night never left them. I started backing up to the door, the cigarette barely held in the tips of my fingers. There was the boy. He was standing on the thick branches of the tree. He stared at me with a cold look on his face, the kind of look a predator has when it looks at the prey. "Screw you!" I screamed, not caring if my neighbors heard me or not. The boy started to laugh. It started as a childish giggle, but soon changed to a dark, throaty, bellowing laugh. I backed slowly into the door and slammed it shut and locked it. I went to sit my cup down, and I nearly missed the counter, and scrambled to correct it and shakily sat it down. I thought about calling the cops again. But what were they going to do? What are they going to say when I call them and tell them I have little demonic children harassing me? God, I almost laughed at this thought myself. Then another thought hit me. A priest. I could call a priest. That's what people do in the movies, right? I grabbed my phone, and after a short Google search, I called the closest Catholic church. An elderly man answered. I could hear his voice and his age, but it was warm and caring. "How can I help you?" he robotically said, as if he'd said it 1,000,000 times before, which I'm sure he had. I need help. I have something demonic or paranormal going on at my house. I didn't know what else to do. I stammered. "Calm down, my child. The church is always willing to help an individual bless a house to get rid of the darkness. What is the address of the activity? I can see if we can arrange a blessing," he replied warmly. I replied to him with my address, and the line went quiet for a few seconds. "Hello?" I asked to make sure I wasn't experiencing the same interference I'd faced last night. "Oh, I'm still here, my child, but I'm afraid I can't help you. We've been to this address on multiple occasions, and the evil that lives there cannot be defeated. I can only give you my advice. Leave that place now. I'm sure the activity is already escalating at an alarming rate. I don't need you to tell me what's happening, as I already know. It's always the same. Strange children who stay in the darkness of the woods during the day. I can assure you, those are not children. I cannot say it enough. Get out of there now. May God have mercy on your soul if you choose to stay. You will not win this battle. After this, the line clicked, and I was met with the drone of a dead phone line. I just stood there with my mouth open, and I started to hyperventilate. My head started to spin, and I stumbled to the living room and flopped down on the couch. My vision started to blur, and that was the last thing I remember. I woke up violently from the couch and took in a deep breath and sat upright. I looked at the clock above the TV, and it said 7 p.m. 7 p.m.? How can that be? I called the priest at 9 a.m. What happened? I jumped up and grabbed my purse and my keys and headed to the car. I ran to the car and fumbled to put the key in the ignition. I turned the key and... nothing. Not a sputter or a click. Just nothing. I slammed my hands on the steering wheel and gripped it tightly in my hands. I reached into my purse for my phone and thought I'd call a friend to come get me. I went to unlock my phone, and the screen lit up for a second, and then it went black. I repeatedly hit the power button, and nothing. My bottom lip started to quiver and let out a spew of very choice words. I then realized that the sun was nearly all the way down. I had to get back in the house. Peered around the yard, and I didn't see any sign of the kids. I opened my car door and took off in a sprint towards my house. I looked to my right, and what I saw made my heart drop. It's the boy. He's running, but he's down on all fours. His body seemed bent in all the wrong places, and he was gaining on me quickly. I took a leap up the small flight of stairs and flung the door open. I turned to look and saw that the boy's face had changed. He was no longer a young boy. It may have resembled one, but his head was twisted all the way round. A big, gaping mouth was at the top of his face, where the eyes would be, and it led down to a nearly non-existent nose, and finally to those fucking black eyes. He let out a screech and leaped towards my arm. His sharp, anglerfish-like teeth sunk into my arm, and I instantly felt a searing pain travelling up the length of my arm. I screamed out in pain and anger as I fell down and landed hard on my tailbone at the entry of the door. I kicked the thing repeatedly in the face, and it squealed in pain and released my arm, but not without ripping my flesh as its teeth left me. I shut the storm door quickly, and it ran up the stairs and slammed into the door. The door instantly turned into a spider web of cracked glass. The thing peered in, and then it started to speak. "Let me in! Let me in! Please, please!" I slammed the red interior door and screamed out in frustration. I pulled my arms to me and wailed loudly. I glanced down, and my chest was covered in blood that was pulsing from my arm. I bit my bottom lip as tears streamed down my face. I didn't want to see the damage the thing had done to my arm, but I didn't have a choice. I slowly pulled my arm away from my chest and nearly retched as a large piece of flesh flopped off to one side, revealing bone, tendon, and muscle. I screamed as the air hit the open wound. I pulled my shirt off and carefully wrapped it around my arm. I tied the excess into a knot and yelped out in pain as I used my other hand and my teeth to pull the knot tight. I tried to stand up, but when I tried to get to my feet, I was instantly hit with a wave of lightheadedness. I quickly slid back down to the floor. Then, the knocking started. It was similar to the night before. It started on the front door, but soon spread to different areas of the house. "Go away!" I screamed over and over, until my voice was a hoarse whisper. I could hear those things begging me to let them in. Oh, I needed to go to the hospital. I'd lost a large amount of blood, and my arm was severely injured. I continued to listen to what sounded like 1,000 different voices at one time. With each minute that passed, they got quieter. Maybe I should open the door and just let them in, I thought to myself. Just open the door and let them finish me off. I woke up, still leaning against the front door. My arm ached and I moaned loudly as I slowly sat up. The shirt I'd wrapped around it was covered in dark, dried blood. I decided that it was best to look at it and assess the damage. I slowly unwrapped the shirt, and on the last time round I closed my eyes and opened them once the shirt was removed. My jaw dropped. My arm was perfectly fine. There wasn't any flesh hanging on by a thread. Well, there was some dried blood, but there was no sign of a wound at all. However, there was a deep, searing pain in my arm. I felt all the pain I had last night, but there was no evidence of any injury, let alone the severe bite wound I'd had last night. I rose to my feet and staggered up the stairs. I turned the shower on and got undressed. I winced in pain as I raised my wounded arm to remove my shirt. I got into the shower and just stood there with the water running down my back. I started to cry. I wasn't a very emotional person, but I don't think anyone could hold it together after the events that had happened to me the previous night. I was jumpy in the shower, and I waited for something crazy to happen while I enjoyed this quiet moment. But to my surprise, everything remained quiet. I got out of the shower, dried off, and threw my robe on for my walk to the bedroom. I got dressed and made my way downstairs. My arm ached and throbbed. I would look at it intently from time to time, just to make sure the wound wasn't back. I went to the cabinet and pulled out a pack of smokes and slapped them on the counter a few times to pack them. I decided that I would try to leave again today. I couldn't stay here. I was afraid to reach out to family or the police, in fear that I would get a one-way ticket to the loony bin. I mean, what would you do in this situation? I started to walk towards my front door to have a cigarette, and when I opened the door, I jumped back in horror. That thing was on my front porch. It smiled at me and ran to the storm door and tapped a long, sharp nail on the glass. "Good morning, miss. Aren't you going to invite me in?" It hissed in a sickening, sweet tone. "Screw you!" I screamed at it. I slammed the door and locked it with a shaking hand. They're not going to believe you. No one is going to believe you. You might as well just let me in and end it all, it said in a sing-song voice. I went upstairs and grabbed my laptop off my desk and bounded back down the stairs. The thing was still talking, but I wasn't paying any attention to it. I went to my email and typed a message to the realtor. I basically told her I'd made a mistake, and I wanted to back out of the house, regardless of the loss I would take. I told her I would leave all the furniture for the next buyer as well. I just needed to leave the property immediately. I hit send and waited. The thing outside was now pounding on the door. It sounded like it was slamming its twisted body against the door like a battering ram. After a few minutes, and me constantly refreshing my email, I got a message back from the realtor. She said she was going to come over and discuss this with me. I started to respond and tell her that it was dangerous for her to come. But at this point she would maybe be a big enough distraction for me to get away from that thing. About 30 minutes later, I heard a car pull into the gravel driveway. I peered out the window and saw it was the realtor. She was in her usual get-up, a suit skirt, and she was making her way to the door. I slowly opened the door, and I was expecting for that thing to be booking it towards her, and her being brutally mauled. But that didn't happen. The monster wasn't on my porch, and I looked around nervously as she walked up the porch stairs. "Hello, dear. Oh, goodness, what happened to your door?" she asked with concern in her voice. "Oh, just some neighborhood kids," I stuttered out. I opened the door and she walked in and glanced around. "What happened to the previous owners of this house?" I asked. She spun on her heel. "Well, I'm afraid I don't know, dear. They just disappeared about a week after buying this place. Police found some shreds of clothes in the woods, but that was about it. It was such a shame. They had children, and there was no trace of them either," she said with sorrow in her voice. I gulped and shuddered at the thought of what really happened to that family. "I want to put this place back on the market. I made a rash decision moving out here. It's way too quiet," I said with a false laugh following. "There will be a loss, dear. I'm sorry it didn't work out for you. Maybe you need to give it more time." She started to say something else, but I cut her off. "I don't need any more time. I was wondering if you could give me a ride to a friend's house. I hate to ask, but my car is having problems and call service isn't that great out here," I replied sheepishly. "Of course. I'm sorry to hear you're not keeping this place. Oh, it's so beautiful out here." She trailed off as she walked around the living room. She dropped me at a friend's house, and I never looked back. I sent a tow truck out to get my car, and sent a moving company to get my laptop and clothes from the house. I didn't want anything else. I didn't ever want to see that house, or those woods, ever again. I bought a loft right downtown with lots of streetlights and people around. I've done my best to forget everything that has happened, but my arm still hurts from the nasty bite that monster gave to me that night. Some days are worse than others, but each day gets a little better. Well, I thought it was getting better. I get those automated emails from my realtor every time she posts a property for sale. I'd been meaning to unsubscribe, but you know how it goes. I was putting a few groceries away when my new email tone chimed from my phone. I walked over, and after a few seconds decided to open it. It was that damn house. I'd been gone for less than a week, and it was already on the market again. They needed to burn that house and all the neighboring woods to the ground. I deleted the email and tossed my phone on the counter. I went back to putting away my groceries, but I froze midway to the fridge and stopped dead in my tracks. I started to hear a persistent knocking on my front door. Thanks for taking the time to drop by and watch this video. You know what would make me a happy doctor? Hitting that like button, leaving a comment, and subscribing to my channel. Go on, I've got plenty more stories to tell you.